In the brutal island-hopping campaigns of the Pacific War, where every advantage could mean the difference between victory and slaughter, the United States possessed a secret weapon that confounded Japanese intelligence throughout the entire conflict. It wasn't a new airplane, a superior weapon, or advanced radar technology. It was a language, an ancient, complex Native American tongue spoken by fewer than 30,000 people, most of them living in the remote deserts of the American Southwest. The Navajo code talkers were young men who took their native language, a language the U.S. government had tried to erase through forced assimilation policies, and transformed it into the only code in modern military history that was never broken by enemy cryptanalysts. They served in every major Marine Corps engagement in the Pacific from 1942 to 1945, transmitting thousands of messages under fire, working in shifts of 24 hours or more without rest, and maintaining perfect security throughout the war and for decades afterward. This is their story, how a conquered people became some of America's most valuable warriors, how they created an unbreakable code from their ancestral language, and how they helped turn the tide in the Pacific while preserving their cultural identity in the face of tremendous pressure to abandon it. The story of the Navajo code talkers is deeply ironic, even tragic, when viewed against the backdrop of American policy toward Native Americans in the early 20th century. For generations, the U.S. government had pursued policies designed to eliminate native languages and cultures through forced assimilation. Native American children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools, where speaking their native languages was forbidden and often punished with beatings, forced labor, or other harsh discipline. The motto of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, the most famous of these institutions, was "Kill the Indian, save the man." Children had their hair cut, their traditional clothing taken away, and their names changed to English names. They were forced to speak only English and punished severely for using their native tongues. The goal was cultural genocide, to erase native identity and force assimilation into white American society. Many of the young Navajo men who would become code talkers had attended these boarding schools or similar day schools on the reservation. They had been punished for speaking Navajo. They had been told their language was primitive, useless, a barrier to progress. Some had their mouths washed out with lye soap for speaking Navajo. Others were beaten. The message was clear: your language, your culture, your identity are inferior and must be abandoned. Yet by the 1940s, as America found itself locked in a desperate war across the Pacific, military strategists realized that this primitive language, so complex that few non-Navajos could speak it and none could learn it quickly, might be the perfect foundation for an unbreakable code. The government that had tried to eliminate Navajo would now desperately need it. The Navajo people, despite decades of betrayal, broken treaties, forced relocation, and cultural suppression, answered their country's call. When the Marine Corps began recruiting Navajo men for a secret communications program, 100 volunteered. They would use the language their grandparents had fought to preserve, the language they had been punished for speaking to help America win the war. To understand why the Navajo Code was necessary, it's important to understand the communications security crisis facing American forces in the Pacific. The Japanese had proven remarkably adept at breaking American codes. Throughout 1942 and early 1943, Japanese intelligence regularly intercepted and decoded American military communications, giving them advance warning of operations, knowledge of American unit strengths and positions, and insight into American strategy. The standard military codes of the era used substitution ciphers and code books, sophisticated but fundamentally breakable systems. With enough intercepted messages, enough time, and enough skilled cryptanalysts, any code based on a known language could theoretically be broken. The Japanese had skilled codebreakers, and they had time. American operations were being compromised, and men were dying because the enemy knew where and when they would attack. The military needed a code system that could be used in the field, transmitted quickly by radio without complex encoding equipment, and resistant to Japanese code-breaking efforts. Several solutions were attempted. Automatic encoding machines were too slow and too bulky for frontline use. Complex code books were cumbersome and time-consuming. What was needed was a code that was fast, flexible, and unbreakable. The solution had actually been attempted before, during World War I, when the U.S. Army used Choctaw speakers to transmit tactical messages during the final campaigns in France. The experiment had worked well. German intelligence couldn't understand the Choctaw language, but after the war, the program was discontinued and largely forgotten. By World War II, military planners had forgotten about using native languages for secure communications. Then, in early 1942, a civil engineer named Philip Johnston approached the Marine Corps with an idea that would change the course of the Pacific War. Philip Johnston was the son of Protestant missionaries who had worked on the Navajo reservation. He had grown up among the Navajo people, learned their language fluently, and understood its complexity. As a child, he had been one of only a handful of non-Navajos who could speak the language. As an adult, watching America struggle in the early months of World War II, Johnston realized that the Navajo language might be exactly what the military needed. Navajo is an incredibly complex language, part of the Athabascan language family, and linguistically unrelated to any European or Asian languages. It is tonal. The same word spoken with different pitch or inflection can have completely different meanings. It has a complex grammar with verb forms that can express subtle distinctions of aspect, mood, and subject-object relationships. The language has no alphabet in the traditional sense and was primarily an oral language with no standardized written form. Most importantly, in 1942, the Navajo language was known to only a few thousand speakers, almost all of them Navajo people living in the American Southwest. No Navajo community existed in Japan. No comprehensive grammar or dictionary existed that would allow Japanese cryptanalysts to study the language. There were probably fewer than 30 non-Navajos in the entire world who could speak it fluently. Johnston believed that messages transmitted in Navajo would be completely unintelligible to Japanese interceptors. But he went further. He proposed developing a code within the Navajo language, using Navajo words to represent military terms that didn't exist in the traditional vocabulary. This code within a code would add an additional layer of security. In February 1942, Johnston arranged a demonstration for Marine Corps officers at Camp Elliott near San Diego. He brought 4 Navajo volunteers and showed how quickly they could transmit and translate messages in their native language. The Marines were impressed but skeptical. Could enough Navajos be recruited? Would they be reliable? Could the system work under combat conditions? The Marine Corps authorized a pilot program. They would recruit 29 Navajo men, train them in communications and the military code, and test the system. If it worked, they would expand the program. If it failed, they would quietly discontinue it and return to conventional codes. The fate of thousands of American lives would depend on whether these 29 young Navajo men could create a code that would withstand the best efforts of Japanese intelligence. In May 1942, the first 29 Navajo recruits arrived at Camp Elliott for basic training in the Special Communications course. These men, who would later be called the Original 29, ranged in age from 15 to 35. Some lied about their age to enlist. Most came from the Navajo Reservation in Arizona and New Mexico, areas of extreme poverty where opportunities for young men were scarce. Many had attended boarding schools, giving them fluency in both English and Navajo, a requirement for the program. The recruits included Carl Gorman, who would become one of the most famous code talkers and later a renowned artist. Chester Nez, who would be the last surviving member of the Original 29 when he died in 2014. John Benally, Samuel Billison, Wilsie Bitsy, and 24 others whose names deserve to be remembered but often aren't. These young men arrived at Camp Elliott expecting standard Marine Corps training. What they received instead was an extraordinary challenge. Create a code based on their native language, a code that would be fast enough for tactical use, comprehensive enough for complex military operations, and secure enough to withstand enemy code breaking. The task was daunting. The Navajo language, while complex and obscure to outsiders, didn't have words for many military terms. There was no Navajo word for tank, or aircraft carrier, or amphibious assault. The language had evolved over centuries in the high desert Southwest, not on modern battlefields. The code talkers would have to invent military vocabulary in Navajo that could be easily remembered, quickly transmitted, and consistently applied. Working together over several weeks, the Original 29 developed a system that was both elegant and practical. They created a vocabulary of Navajo words to represent military terms, using associations that would be meaningful to Navajo speakers, but opaque to outsiders. They developed a phonetic alphabet using Navajo words for animals and objects, and they memorized everything. No written code books would be carried into combat, eliminating the risk of capture and compromise. The system they created had several components. First, a military vocabulary using Navajo words with logical associations. These associations made sense to Navajo speakers. A submarine moved through water like an ironfish. A hummingbird's darting flight resembled a fighter plane. A crow diving for food was like a dive bomber attacking. The associations helped the code talkers remember the extensive vocabulary while ensuring the terms meant nothing to Japanese interceptors. The system was brilliant in its simplicity. To spell the word Pacific, a code talker would say, pig and cat, icefish, ice cat, each Navajo word representing the first letter of its English translation. Third, they developed procedures for encoding and transmitting messages, including systems for expressing numbers, punctuation, and emphasis. They practiced until they could encode and decode messages almost instantaneously. By the end of their training, the Original 29 had created a code that was fast, flexible, and, as they would prove, absolutely unbreakable. Now they had to prove it would work in combat. Before the code talkers could be deployed to combat units, the Marine Corps needed to verify that the system actually worked. In September 1942, extensive field tests were conducted comparing the Navajo code to standard military communication methods. The results were extraordinary. The code talkers could encode, transmit, and decode a 3-line English message in 20 seconds. The same message, using standard military code and encryption machines, took 30 minutes. The speed advantage was enormous. In combat situations where every second could mean the difference between life and death, the Navajo code was over 90 times faster. More importantly, the code proved impossible for enemy cryptanalysts to break during exercises. Military intelligence officers were given recordings of Navajo code transmissions and asked to break them. Despite knowing the messages were in Navajo, having access to what limited published materials existed on the Navajo language, and being given ample time, they couldn't decipher the messages. The code within the code, the use of code words within the already obscure Navajo language, made it effectively unbreakable. Marine Corps commanders were convinced. They authorized a major expansion of the program. Hundreds more Navajo men would be recruited and trained. The code talkers would be assigned to frontline combat units and would serve in every major Marine Corps operation for the remainder of the war. But success brought new challenges. The code talkers would need to maintain perfect security. They would need to work under combat conditions, exhausted, under fire, sometimes wounded, and still transmit messages flawlessly. And they would need to survive because the code was in their heads. If all the code talkers in a unit were killed, the code died with them. The Marine Corps took extraordinary measures to protect the code talkers. Each was assigned a bodyguard, ostensibly to protect them from being captured, but with the unspoken understanding that the bodyguard's ultimate responsibility was to kill the code talker rather than allow him to be taken prisoner with the code intact. The code talkers knew this and accepted it as part of their duty. The first code talkers arrived at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands in late 1942, joining Marine units already locked in a desperate struggle for control of the island. Guadalcanal was America's first major offensive in the Pacific, and it was turning into a brutal attrition battle. The Japanese were fighting with fanatical determination, and American casualties were mounting. The code talkers were thrown directly into the chaos. They worked in combat command posts, often just behind the front lines, transmitting messages between units, coordinating artillery fire, calling in airstrikes, and relaying intelligence reports. They worked in shifts that often exceeded 24 hours, catching sleep when they could, eating when there was time, and always ready to jump on the radio when a message needed to be sent. Private First Class Carl Gorman, one of the original 29, later described his first experience transmitting under fire. We were in a dugout, shells landing all around us. The radio operator handed me the microphone and I started speaking Navajo. It felt strange. This was my language, the language my teachers had beaten me for speaking, and now I was using it to call in artillery strikes on the Japanese. But I didn't have time to think about the irony. I just transmitted the message and waited for confirmation. The effectiveness of the code was immediately apparent. Messages that would have taken 30 minutes to encode using conventional methods were transmitted in seconds. Commanders could communicate tactical changes in real time. Artillery coordinators could adjust fire missions instantly. The speed and security of Navajo code transmissions gave American forces a significant tactical advantage. More importantly, the Japanese couldn't understand a word. Intercepted transmissions were completely unintelligible. Japanese intelligence officers initially thought they were listening to a new type of encryption. They didn't realize they were hearing a language. When they finally identified the transmissions as a Native American language, they still couldn't break the code. They had no Navajo speakers, no comprehensive grammar or dictionary, and no way to learn the language quickly enough to be useful. Some Japanese commanders reportedly didn't believe the Americans were using a real language. They thought it was some kind of elaborate, machine-generated code. The idea that a primitive Native American language could foil sophisticated Japanese cryptanalysis was apparently too incredible to accept. The success at Guadalcanal led to rapid expansion of the Code Talker program. By 1943, the Marine Corps was actively recruiting Navajo men for the program. Recruiters visited the Navajo reservation, holding meetings and explaining the program. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of young Navajo men volunteered. Many had practical motivations. The reservation economy offered few opportunities, and military service meant steady pay, food, clothing, and a chance to see the world beyond the remote Southwest. But many also felt a genuine patriotism and a desire to prove themselves. Despite decades of mistreatment by the federal government, they saw themselves as Americans and wanted to serve their country. Some faced opposition from their families and communities. Traditional Navajo culture was nonviolent, and warriors who took life were required to undergo purification ceremonies. Some medicine men worried that exposure to warfare would spiritually harm the young men. Others worried that serving in the military meant abandoning Navajo ways and becoming absorbed into white culture. But the volunteers kept coming. By the end of 1943, over 200 Navajo code talkers had been trained and deployed to Marine units throughout the Pacific. By the war's end, approximately 400 Navajo men would serve as code talkers, with several hundred more serving in other military capacities. The training program at Camp Elliott, and later Camp Pendleton, was intensive. Recruits had to complete standard Marine Corps boot camp, one of the toughest military training programs in the world, and then attend the specialized code school. They had to memorize hundreds of code words, learn radio operation and maintenance, and practice encoding and decoding messages until they could do it automatically, even under extreme stress. The code itself was expanded and refined as the war progressed. The original 29 had created a vocabulary of about 200 terms. By 1945, the code included over 600 terms, covering virtually every military contingency. New words were added to cover new weapons, tactics, and situations. The code became more sophisticated and more comprehensive while remaining completely secure. Remarkably, the security was maintained not through written code books, but through memorization. Each code talker committed the entire code to memory. This had several advantages. No code books could be captured, no written evidence of the system existed in the field, and the code talkers could operate even if all their equipment was destroyed. But it also meant that training was demanding, and the code talkers had to maintain their linguistic and memory skills constantly. The Battle of Tarawa in November 1943 demonstrated the code talkers' value in the most intense combat conditions. Tarawa was a heavily fortified Japanese base in the Gilbert Islands, and the marine assault was the first American test of attacking a well-defended atoll. The battle would be one of the bloodiest in Marine Corps history. 6 Navajo code talkers participated in the Tarawa assault, going ashore with the assault waves. They operated from shell craters, destroyed bunkers, and whatever cover they could find, while Japanese defenders poured fire on the beachhead. The code talkers transmitted messages coordinating the complex assault, calling in naval gunfire support, directing airstrikes, and maintaining communication between units pinned down across the small island. The speed of their transmissions was critical. At Tarawa, the Marines needed to coordinate actions across a chaotic battlefield where conventional communications were breaking down. Radio nets were congested with traffic, wire communications were cut by shell fire, and runners were being killed trying to deliver messages by hand. The code talkers cut through the congestion with clear, fast transmissions that commanders could understand immediately. During the first 48 hours of fighting at Tarawa, the 6 code talkers transmitted over 800 messages without error. The messages coordinated artillery fire that helped break Japanese defensive positions, directed airstrikes that destroyed enemy bunkers, and maintained the flow of intelligence that allowed commanders to adjust tactics in real time. But the code talkers paid a price. One was severely wounded by Japanese fire while transmitting from an exposed position. Another suffered from shell shock after being buried alive when a bunker collapsed. All 6 were recommended for commendations for their performance under fire, though such recognition was limited by the classified nature of their work. After Tarawa, Marine commanders throughout the Pacific were requesting code talkers for their units. The demand exceeded supply. There simply weren't enough trained code talkers to assign to every unit that wanted them. The Marine Corps increased recruitment efforts, but it took time to train new code talkers to operational proficiency. While the code talkers proved their value in combat, they also faced discrimination and misunderstanding within the military and American society. Despite wearing Marine Corps uniforms and risking their lives for their country, many code talkers encountered racism and prejudice from fellow Americans. Some were mistaken for Japanese soldiers because of their dark hair and Asian features. There are multiple documented cases of code talkers being detained or even threatened by American soldiers who thought they were enemy infiltrators. Their bodyguards often had to intervene, explaining that these Japanese-looking Marines were actually Native Americans serving in a classified program. Off the battlefield, many code talkers faced discrimination in towns near military bases. Some restaurants refused to serve them. Some businesses wouldn't allow them entry. In some places, they encountered the same "No Indians" signs that had been common in the Southwest for decades. They were fighting for a country that still treated them as second-class citizens. Within their units, reactions varied. Some Marines accepted the code talkers as comrades and respected their unique skills. Others treated them as exotic curiosities or with barely concealed prejudice. Some officers understood the value of the code and protected their code talkers zealously. Others viewed them as an unnecessary complication and tried to minimize their role. The code talkers also struggled with the tension between their Marine identity and their Navajo identity. The Marine Corps emphasized uniformity, discipline, and conformity. Navajo culture emphasized harmony, respect for elders, and community consensus. The Marine Corps was organized hierarchically with rigid rank structures. Navajo society was more egalitarian with leadership based on demonstrated wisdom rather than formal authority. Some code talkers found ways to maintain their cultural practices even in combat zones. They carried sacred items, said traditional prayers, and tried to follow Navajo protocols as much as possible. Others felt the pressure to abandon Navajo ways and fully assimilate into Marine culture. The tension between these two identities, Marine and Navajo, was a constant challenge. In June 1944, the U.S. launched Operation Forager, the invasion of the Mariana Islands, including Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These battles would be among the largest and bloodiest of the Pacific War, involving tens of thousands of troops and weeks of brutal fighting. The Marianas were strategically vital. Capturing them would put American B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. Over 80 code talkers participated in the Marianas campaign, the largest concentration of code talkers in any single operation up to that point. They were assigned to division, regiment, and battalion communication sections, ensuring that every level of command had access to secure, rapid communications. The complexity of the Marianas operations tested the code to its limits. Multiple divisions were conducting simultaneous operations across several islands. Naval units were providing fire support. Army, Air Force, and Navy aircraft were conducting strikes. Logistics were flowing through multiple channels. The communication requirements were enormous. The code talkers handled it flawlessly. They transmitted thousands of messages coordinating these complex operations. When conventional communication systems became overloaded or compromised, commanders turned to the code talkers. The speed and reliability of Navajo code transmissions kept the operations running smoothly. At Saipan, the largest of the Mariana Islands, the fighting was particularly intense. The Japanese garrison fought with suicidal determination, and the battle culminated in massive banzai attacks, where thousands of Japanese soldiers charged American positions. The code talkers worked around the clock, transmitting intelligence about Japanese movements, coordinating defensive fire, and maintaining communication as the tactical situation changed by the minute. Private First Class Samuel Billison, one of the original 29, later described the experience. "We worked in shifts, but there was never enough time to sleep. Messages kept coming, and we had to transmit them. Sometimes we'd be transmitting for 12, 16, even 20 hours straight. Your voice would get hoarse, your mind would get foggy, but you couldn't make mistakes. One wrong word could cost lives." The performance of the code talkers at Saipan earned them praise from senior commanders. Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the V Amphibious Corps, stated, "Without the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." While he was referring to a future battle, his assessment was based on observing the code talkers' performance in the Marianas. As the war progressed and operations became more complex, the code continued to evolve. New terms were added to cover new situations. Procedures were refined based on combat experience. The code talkers developed shorthand methods for frequently transmitted information, speeding up transmissions even more. One innovation was the development of alternate words for frequently used terms. For example, instead of always using the same Navajo word for battleship, the code included 3 different Navajo words that meant battleship, lotso, whale, lotso yazi, small whale, and inavalo, angry whale. This made the code even harder to break. Even if Japanese cryptanalysts identified one code word, messages using alternate words would remain secure. The code talkers also developed informal additions to the code based on shared experiences. Inside jokes, references to specific battles, or mentions of particular commanders might be encoded using terms that weren't in the official code, but that all code talkers understood. This flexibility made the code even more difficult for outsiders to penetrate. Security remained paramount. Code talkers were forbidden from discussing the code with anyone, even other Marines. They couldn't write letters home mentioning their work. They couldn't tell their families what they did. If captured, they were under orders to reveal nothing, an order that thankfully never had to be tested, as no code talker was captured during the war. The secrecy extended to their own people. When code talkers went home on leave, they couldn't tell their families about the code. Their parents and siblings knew they were in the Marines, but not what they did. This secrecy was difficult for men from a culture that valued community and sharing, but they maintained it perfectly. Interestingly, there's no evidence that the Japanese ever came close to breaking the Navajo code. Post-war interrogations of Japanese intelligence officers revealed that they had identified the transmissions as a Native American language and had even captured a Navajo soldier, not a code talker, and tried to use him to decipher the code. But the captured soldier, who spoke Navajo, couldn't understand the code transmissions. The code words had no meaning to him, and without knowing the system, he was as baffled as the Japanese. This demonstrates the brilliance of the code's design. It wasn't simply a matter of speaking Navajo. The code within the code, the specialized vocabulary, the phonetic alphabet, the procedures, made it secure even against someone who spoke the base language. The Battle of Peleliu in September-November 1944 was one of the most brutal battles in the Pacific War. The island was heavily fortified with extensive cave systems and bunkers. The Japanese had learned from earlier defeats and had prepared a defense in depth designed to inflict maximum casualties on the attackers. The battle that American commanders thought would take a few days lasted over 2 months. 21 code talkers participated in the Peleliu operation, and their performance under some of the worst combat conditions of the war was extraordinary. The heat was extreme. Temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The terrain was a nightmare of sharp coral rock that shredded clothing and skin. Water was scarce. Casualties were enormous. The code talkers worked from combat command posts that were under near constant fire. Japanese artillery and mortars targeted American communication centers, forcing the code talkers to repeatedly relocate their equipment and continue transmitting even as shells fell around them. Several code talkers were wounded at Peleliu, but continued working until they physically couldn't continue. One code talker, Private First Class Johnny Manuelito, transmitted messages for 48 hours straight during a critical phase of the battle, stopping only when he collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration. He was evacuated, treated, and returned to duty 3 days later. His continuous transmissions had helped coordinate the complex operations needed to reduce Japanese cave positions. The complexity of communications at Peleliu was enormous. Multiple units were operating simultaneously across difficult terrain. Naval gunfire support had to be precisely coordinated to avoid hitting American troops. Airstrikes needed accurate targeting information. Artillery fire had to be adjusted constantly as the front lines shifted. The code talkers handled thousands of transmissions, maintaining the flow of information that kept the operation running. Major General William Rupertus, commanding the 1st Marine Division, later wrote, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. Without them, the Marines would not have taken Peleliu." His statement reflected the growing recognition among Marine commanders that the code talkers weren't just a useful asset, they were essential to victory. The Battle of Iwo Jima in March 1945, was the code talkers' greatest test. Over 400 code talkers participated in the operation, working around the clock for the entire 36-day battle. They transmitted over 800 messages during the first 48 hours alone, and thousands more throughout the battle. The complexity, intensity, and duration of Iwo Jima required the code system to perform at its absolute peak, and it did. Iwo Jima was strategically vital. The island was needed as an emergency landing site for B-29 bombers attacking Japan and as a base for fighter escorts. But the Japanese had turned the island into a fortress with extensive underground tunnels, bunkers, and defensive positions. The battle would be the costliest in Marine Corps history, with nearly 7,000 Marines killed and over 20,000 wounded. The code talkers worked in shifts, but during critical phases of the battle, All of them were on duty simultaneously. They transmitted from command posts just behind the front lines, often within range of Japanese artillery. They called in naval gunfire and airstrikes with pinpoint accuracy. They coordinated the movement of tanks and infantry. They transmitted intelligence about Japanese positions. They maintained communication between units scattered across the volcanic island. The speed of Navajo code transmissions was critical at Iwo Jima. The battle moved quickly despite the difficult terrain, and commanders needed real-time information to make tactical decisions. The code talkers provided that information flow, transmitting messages in seconds that would have taken many minutes using conventional codes. One dramatic incident involved code talker Private First Class Jack Jones, who was transmitting from a forward observation post when Japanese forces overran the position. Jones continued transmitting even as Japanese soldiers entered the bunker. His last message, coordinates for artillery fire on his own position, helped stop the Japanese counterattack. Jones survived by hiding in the bunker, and he was rescued the next day when Marines retook the position. The performance of the code talkers at Iwo Jima earned them widespread recognition within the Marine Corps. Major Howard Connor, a signal officer at Iwo Jima, stated, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." Major General Curtis Rocky, commanding the 5th Marine Division, added his own praise. The entire operation was directed by Navajo code. Our corps could not have landed without them. These weren't idle compliments. By Iwo Jima, the code talkers had proven themselves indispensable to Marine Corps operations. Every Marine division, regiment, and many battalions had code talkers assigned. Commanders planned operations knowing they could communicate securely and rapidly thanks to the Navajo code. The code talkers had become an integral part of how the Marine Corps fought. The Battle of Okinawa, which lasted from April to June 1945, would be the largest and deadliest battle of the Pacific War. Over 100,000 Japanese defenders and nearly 150,000 Okinawan civilians would die. American casualties exceeded 50,000, including over 12,000 killed. The scale and intensity of Okinawa exceeded anything that had come before. The code talkers at Okinawa, over 50 of them assigned to various units, faced their longest sustained combat operation. The battle lasted 82 days, and the code talkers worked throughout in conditions that became progressively worse. Heavy rains turned the battlefield into a quagmire of mud. Japanese artillery and kamikaze attacks were constant. The psychological strain of sustained combat affected everyone, including the code talkers. But they continued to perform flawlessly. They transmitted thousands of messages coordinating the complex ground operations. They maintained communication with Navy ships providing fire support offshore. They helped coordinate air support missions. They kept information flowing despite equipment failures, casualties among communication personnel, and the general chaos of a battle that seemed like it would never end. One challenge at Okinawa was the sheer volume of communications. With over 100,000 American troops involved in the operation, the radio nets were constantly congested. The code talkers' fast transmission speed helped reduce congestion. They could send a message and clear the net for other traffic much faster than conventional communications. This efficiency was vital in managing the enormous flow of information. Several code talkers were wounded at Okinawa. Private First Class Jimmy King was hit by Japanese artillery fire while transmitting a message. He finished transmitting before allowing himself to be evacuated for treatment. Private First Class Paul Blatchford was buried alive when his command post took a direct hit. He was dug out by fellow Marines and returned to duty after recovering from his injuries. By the time Okinawa ended in late June 1945, the Code Talkers had been in continuous combat operations for nearly 3 years. Many were exhausted, both physically and mentally. The Code Talkers at Okinawa knew they were likely being prepared for the invasion of Japan itself, an operation that promised to dwarf even Okinawa in scale and casualties. Then, in August 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan surrendered. The invasion of Japan was cancelled. The war was over. The Code Talkers, who had served in every major Marine Corps battle in the Pacific, had made it through. When the Code Talkers returned home after the war, they faced a complicated re-entry into civilian life. Like many veterans, they struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares about combat. They found it difficult to adjust to the routine of civilian life after years of combat. They missed the camaraderie of their units. But the Code Talkers faced additional challenges. They couldn't talk about what they had done. The Navajo Code remained classified. The Marine Corps believed it might be needed in future conflicts. This meant the Code Talkers had to keep silent about their wartime service, unable to share their experiences even with their families. Many Code Talkers didn't receive the recognition they deserved because their service was classified. They had performed extraordinary feats of bravery and endurance, but they couldn't talk about it. While other veterans could share their stories, wear their decorations, and be recognized for their service, the Code Talkers had to remain silent. They returned to the Navajo reservation, where economic conditions remained difficult. The wartime boom that had brought prosperity to much of America had largely bypassed the reservation. Jobs were scarce, education opportunities were limited, and the federal government's paternalistic control over reservation affairs continued. Many Code Talkers struggled to find work or restart their lives. Some faced skepticism from traditional Navajos about whether they had been corrupted by military service and exposure to white culture. Traditional beliefs held that killing in warfare created spiritual imbalance that required purification ceremonies. Some Code Talkers underwent these ceremonies, others didn't. The question of how to integrate their military service with their Navajo identity was challenging. Yet despite these difficulties, most Code Talkers integrated back into their communities and lived quiet, productive lives. They raised families, worked various jobs, participated in their communities, and maintained the silence about their wartime service. They held the secret for over 2 decades. In 1968, the Navajo Code was finally declassified. After 23 years of silence, the Code Talkers could finally talk about what they had done. The declassification came partly because the military determined the code was unlikely to be used in future conflicts, and partly because of growing interest in Native American history during the Civil Rights era. The declassification allowed historians to begin documenting the Code Talkers' story. Researchers interviewed veterans, gathered documents, and pieced together the full history of the program. Books and articles began to appear, bringing the Code Talkers' story to public attention. But recognition came slowly. The first major public recognition came in 1982, when President Ronald Reagan declared August 14th National Navajo Code Talkers Day, and presented a certificate of recognition to the Code Talkers. It was a symbolic gesture, but for the aging veterans it meant something to finally receive public acknowledgement of their service. In 2000, Congress passed legislation authorizing the presentation of Congressional Gold Medals to the Code Talkers. one medal for each of the original 29, and a single medal to be shared among all subsequent code talkers. President Bill Clinton presented the medals in a ceremony at the Capitol in 2001. By this time, only a handful of the original 29 were still alive to receive their medals. The ceremony was emotional. These elderly men, many now in their 80s, finally received the recognition they deserved. They wore their Marine Corps uniforms, now with a Congressional Gold Medal added to their ribbons. They stood in the Capitol Rotunda, honored by the government that had once tried to eliminate their language. Chester Nez, one of the original 29, said at the ceremony, "We were proud to serve our country. The code was successful because our language is very complicated. The Japanese never broke it. We are happy that our language, which they tried to take away from us in school, was used to help win the war." The story of the Code Talkers has had a profound impact on both American and Navajo culture. For the broader American public, the Code Talkers' story has become a symbol of patriotism, service, and the contributions of Native Americans to the country's military history. Their story has been told in books, films, documentaries, and educational materials. For the Navajo people, the Code Talkers' story has been a source of immense pride. Here was proof that Navajo language and culture had value, that the traditional ways weren't inferior to white American culture. The Code Talkers demonstrated that one could be both fully Navajo and fully American, that these identities weren't contradictory, but complementary. The Code Talker story has also influenced attitudes toward native languages. For decades, Native American languages had been systematically suppressed. Children were punished for speaking them, and many languages were dying as older generations passed away. The Code Talker's story provided a powerful argument for preserving native languages. They weren't just cultural artifacts. They had practical value. This helped fuel language preservation efforts throughout Indian country. Educational programs now teach about the Code Talkers in schools across America. Students learn about the complexity of the Navajo language, the clever design of the code, and the bravery of the men who used it. The story has become part of the standard curriculum in teaching about World War II. The Marine Corps has incorporated the Code Talker's story into its own institutional memory and culture. The Code Talkers are held up as examples of the Marine Corps values of honor, courage, and commitment. Marine Corps bases have monuments to the Code Talkers, and their story is taught in leadership and communications courses. From a cryptographic perspective, the Navajo Code was remarkable in several ways. First, it was based on a language that was extremely difficult to learn for non-native speakers. Navajo is a tonal language with complex grammar, and linguists estimate it takes an average adult English speaker about 480 weeks of intensive study to achieve general proficiency, far longer than most European or Asian languages. Second, the Navajo language had no written standard in the 1940s. This meant there were no textbooks, dictionaries, or grammars that Japanese cryptanalysts could use to study the language. Even if they had captured a code talker, which they never did, they would have faced enormous difficulties in documenting and understanding the language. Third, the code within the code added an additional layer of security. Even if Japanese intelligence had somehow learned Navajo, they still wouldn't have understood the military vocabulary. The code words had no logical connection to their meanings. Only those who had memorized the code could translate them. Fourth, the code was memorized rather than written down. This eliminated the risk of code books being captured and prevented any documentary evidence from falling into enemy hands. The code lived entirely in the minds of the code talkers, making it impossible to steal or intercept. Fifth, the code could be modified quickly. New words could be added or changed without requiring new equipment or complex retraining. This flexibility meant the code could evolve to meet changing needs without compromising security. From a linguistic perspective, the code talker's creation of military vocabulary in Navajo is fascinating. They had to find ways to express concepts that didn't exist in traditional Navajo culture using the resources of the language. Their solutions, using metaphorical associations, descriptive compounds, and borrowed terms, demonstrate remarkable creativity and linguistic skill. Despite extensive research and documentation, some aspects of the code talker's story remain unclear or controversial. One question is whether there were code talkers from other Native American tribes. There is evidence that at least one Comanche code was used in the European theater, and there may have been limited use of other native languages. However, the Navajo code was by far the largest and most successful program. Another question concerns the exact number of code talkers. The Tutuo's commonly cited figure is approximately 400, but exact records are incomplete. Some men may have been trained in the code but never deployed. Others may have served in communications roles without being formally designated as code talkers. The Marine Corps' own records are not entirely clear on this point. There is also debate about recognition and credit. While the Navajo code talkers have received substantial recognition since declassification, some argue that individual code talkers deserved medals and commendations that they never received because of the classified nature of their work. Others argue that focusing on the code talkers has overshadowed the contributions of other Native Americans who served in World War II in different capacities. Some Navajo people have also raised concerns about how the code talkers' story has been told. They worry that the emphasis on their military service obscures the broader history of U.S.-Navajo relations, including the Long Walk, forced assimilation policies, and ongoing issues of poverty and discrimination on the reservation. They fear the code talker's story is used to present a simplistic narrative of patriotism that ignores these more complicated historical realities. As the 21st century progressed, the code talkers passed away one by one. Each death marked the loss of a living connection to one of the most remarkable stories in military history. Memorial services celebrated their lives and their service, and their stories were recorded for posterity. Chester Nez, the last surviving member of the original 29, died on June 4, 2014 at the age of 93. His death marked the end of an era. No longer could researchers interview one of the men who had actually created the code, who had trained the subsequent code talkers, who had fought through the entire Pacific War using the Navajo language that his teachers had tried to beat out of him as a child. Other code talkers continued to pass away in the following years. Each death brought renewed attention to their story, obituaries in major newspapers, memorial services attended by Marine Corps officials and Navajo Nation leaders. The remaining code talkers became ever more precious, honored elders whose stories were recorded, whose appearances at events were celebrated, whose wisdom was sought. Thomas H. Bigay, one of the last surviving code talkers, died in 2023 at the age of 97. Samuel Sandoval died in 2022 at 98. John Kinsel Sr. died in 2022 at 107. Each passing diminished the number of living connections to this extraordinary chapter of history. As of 2024, only a handful of code talkers remain alive, all well into their 90s or older. Soon there will be none left, and the story of the code talkers will pass entirely from living memory into history. The story of the Code Talkers raises profound questions about identity, loyalty, and justice. How do we understand the patriotism of people who served a country that had systematically oppressed them in their culture? How do we reconcile the Code Talkers' service with the broader history of U.S. government mistreatment of Native Americans? The Code Talkers themselves offered various answers to these questions. Some emphasized that they were fighting for their families, their communities, and the Navajo Nation, not necessarily for the U.S. government. They saw the war as a threat to all peoples, including the Navajo, and they fought to defend their land and people. Others spoke of dual identities. They were both Navajo and American, and they didn't see these as contradictory. They could be proud of their Navajo heritage and culture, while also claiming their rights and responsibilities as American citizens. Their military service was a way of asserting their place in American society. Still, others frankly acknowledged the irony and injustice of their situation but chose to serve anyway. They knew the history of broken treaties, forced relocations, and cultural suppression. But they believed that serving their country with distinction might help improve conditions for Native Americans and demonstrate that they deserved equal treatment. These different perspectives remind us that the Code Talkers were individuals with their own thoughts, motivations, and understandings of their situation. They weren't a monolithic group with a single perspective, and their story can't be reduced to a simple narrative of either patriotic service or tragic irony. Today, the legacy of the Code Talkers lives on in multiple ways. The Navajo Nation honors them with monuments, museums, and annual commemorations. The Code Talker Museum in Bonito, New Mexico, preserves their story and educates visitors about their contributions. Schools throughout the Navajo Nation teach about the Code Talkers as part of their history curriculum. The Marine Corps maintains strong ties to the Navajo Nation and honors the Code Talkers' memory. Marine recruiters still visit the reservation, and Navajo men and women continue to serve in the Marine Corps. The Code Talkers' story is taught at Marine Corps training facilities as an example of the Corps' values and tradition. In popular culture, the Code Talkers have been featured in films like Wind Talkers, 2002, though the film took considerable dramatic license with the actual history. Numerous books, both historical accounts and fictionalized versions, have told their story. Their image appears on commemorative coins, stamps, and other memorabilia. Perhaps most importantly, the Code Talkers' story has inspired efforts to preserve Native American languages. The recognition that the Navajo language helped win World War II has provided powerful support for language preservation programs. The Navajo Nation has invested in language education, and many schools on the reservation now teach Navajo language and culture. The Code Talkers demonstrated that native languages and cultures aren't obstacles to participation in modern society, but valuable resources that can contribute to the nation's success. Their story has helped shift public perception of Native American cultures from seeing them as primitive or backward to recognizing them as sophisticated and valuable. The Navajo Code Talkers took a language that the U.S. government had tried to eliminate and used it to help win World War II. They transformed a primitive tongue into the most secure communication system in military history. They proved that complexity could be strength, that cultural diversity was an asset, and that loyalty and patriotism could coexist with a distinct cultural identity. The code they created was never broken by Japanese intelligence despite years of effort. It was transmitted thousands of times under combat conditions ranging from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the volcanic wastes of Iwo Jima. It helped coordinate operations involving hundreds of thousands of troops. It saved countless American lives by maintaining secure communications when conventional codes had been compromised. But the code talkers' legacy extends beyond their cryptographic achievement. They demonstrated courage under fire, working in exposed positions while shells fell around them. They showed endurance, transmitting messages for 24, 36, or 48 hours straight without rest. They proved their loyalty to a country that had not always been loyal to them. Most importantly, they preserved their language and culture. They could have abandoned their Navajo identity, assimilated fully into white American culture, and sought acceptance through conformity. Instead, they used their Navajo language, the language they had been punished for speaking, to serve their country. In doing so, they demonstrated that being Navajo and being American weren't contradictory, but complementary. Today, as the last code talkers pass away, their story becomes ever more important. It reminds us of the contributions Native Americans have made to this country's defense. It demonstrates the value of linguistic and cultural diversity. It shows that some of America's greatest strengths come from its diversity, not despite it, but because of it. The Navajo code talkers created an unbreakable code, but their greatest legacy may be the unbreakable spirit they demonstrated, a commitment to serve their country and preserve their culture, to be both Navajo and American, to use their unique identity not as a barrier, but as a bridge. That legacy will endure long after the last code talker has joined his brothers in the final formation. The Navajo language was our weapon, Chester Nez once said. It was the weapon that won the war in the Pacific. We were proud to serve, proud to use our language, proud to be Marines, and proud to be Navajo. They were, and they remain, unbreakable.